Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Off This Thing. This is an off-the-cuff monologue where we just kind of go for it. Today's topic comes from a comment I got on my conservatives versus the alt-right video. I got accused in one of the comments of forwarding the alt-right boogeyman because the alt-right really isn't a thing. It kind of spurred some thought on my part back to not only an undergrad class, but also a graduate class where we kind of dived into this a little bit. So first, in my geopolitics class in undergrad, one day my professor said, "Hey, think of the craziest phobia you can think of." And immediately I blurted out luposlipophobia. And everybody kind of giggled, and my professor's like, "Okay, I like it, but what is it?" And I was, of course, referencing the Gary Larson cartoon, The Far Side, where he has this picture of this kid, and basically luposlipophobia is the fear of being chased by wolves around the kitchen table while wearing socks on a linoleum floor or something like that. And the point is that it's a very unrealistic fear. It doesn't really exist. And our prof was trying to make the point that if enough people actually believe in that fear and they're willing to act on that fear, then the candidates who are running for office actually have to address that fear or risk alienating voters. And it was kind of interesting to think about, what if 20% of the population really did fear luposlipophobia? We laugh about that, and it is kind of silly, but suddenly you can see how a candidate would have a choice. And we say, well, luposlipophobia isn't a thing. And the response comes back, no, it isn't. But if you alienate 20% of your voters, your election isn't a thing either. And this kind of feeds into the alt-right and some other groups. In fact, I think Antifa and ISIS both fit into this as well. So for example, if we were to talk about the alt-right, it is somewhat decentralized. You could ask questions like, who are leaders? You might come up with Jared Taylor or Richard Spencer, but those are kind of vague ideas. At the same time, you have people willing to show up to alt-right rallies and make it a thing. Similarly, in fact, even more so with Antifa, who is the leader of Antifa? There's not really a single name that comes to mind. Now you could ask, who are influencers of Antifa? And you might come up with names like Saul Alinsky or Noam Chomsky or Bernie Sanders, people that influence the ideology that Antifa holds to. But there is no singular credo outside of kind of being vaguely anti-fascist while at the same time acting somewhat violent and militantly fascist. There's not even a lot of cohesion or coherence in a lot of those beliefs, but does it matter? I argue no, it really doesn't matter. You still have students willing to show up dressed in black, wearing masks, throwing things at cops, throwing things at people they don't like, beating up Trump supporters, even if Trump supporters happen to be minorities, trying to shut down the free speech of gay men and so on because they don't agree with that ideology. Antifa is definitely a thing. You have people that are willing to show up under that flag, under that name, and cause problems. At that point, it's very much a thing. And the Berkeley Police Department would definitely agree. Similarly with ISIS, this is where it gets even more interesting. ISIS has taken some severe beatings in the last week. I believe in the last 3 or 4 days, 850 fighters have been killed by Russian forces. Raqqa is like 80% liberated from ISIS. The war is not going well for them. They are losing not only ground, but they are losing personnel and they are losing materials and equipment very quickly. However, ISIS is still dangerous, like a cornered animal. One of the things that makes it dangerous is that for a long time, ISIS was a name that inspired fear. And as long as there are people that believe that ISIS still has that kind of power in that name, there are people who are going to do things like the Orlando shooting, like the Russian ambassador who was shot, I believe, in Turkey. There are people who are willing to take action and do things in the name of ISIS, and usually do very horrible things, driving trucks through crowds or whatever, as we've seen in France and in Germany. And whether or not the leader of ISIS is dead doesn't matter. Whether or not ISIS is losing every day doesn't matter. All that matters is, are there people willing to show up under that name, under that flag, and cause problems? Are they willing to create a force, an entity that has to be dealt with on some level by, militaries, governments, cultures, what have you? And the answer is yes. And in the class where we talked about the end of terrorism, which was a graduate class, that was the question that was asked. How does ISIS end? And this is why the tail end of ISIS could last for years, because as long as there's somebody who's willing to say, I can join forces with that name inspires fear. If I die for that name, or if I blow something up in that name, I will be remembered. As long as that's true, ISIS in a very real way still does exist. And you can say the same thing for the alt-right, and you can say the same thing for Antifa. As long as people are willing to show up under those flags, under those names, and act even vaguely in accordance with that ideology and that movement are a thing. Whether it's leaderless or not, whether or not there's a strict code of conduct, it doesn't really matter. We see with ISIS that they hold to a very specific and strict version of Islam, which of course forbids adultery. And at the same time, they have sex slaves, which is kind of adultery in a way. It doesn't really matter that there's a contradiction there. Pointing out the contradiction does not end the group, nor does it help you win the war. They have to be defeated in some other way. And that's why these groups, I think, can be so pervasive, is that as long as there's a name and as long as there's some semblance of respect and fear that goes with that name, there will be people who want to associate with it. And so, yes, each one of these groups, the alt-right, Antifa, and ISIS, they are very much a thing, and they will be, as long as people are willing to join them. Anyway, if you like this video, go ahead and subscribe or give it a like or whatever. Thank you for listening. I really do appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.